Tonight, we're going to talk about a land that no longer exists, a vast stretch of earth that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, a place where rivers wound through wide grassy plains, where herds of deer and horses grazed beneath open skies, where families of hunter-gatherers built their fires, told their stories, and buried their dead. A land where children were born, where old men watched the sunset, where entire generations lived and loved and died over thousands of years. And yet today, if you were to look at a map of Europe, you would find nothing where this land once stood. Nothing at all. Only the cold, grey waters of the North Sea, because the land I am speaking of has a name. Its name is Doggerland, and it lies now beneath the waves, drowned and lost, an entire country swallowed by the sea. But before we begin sinking into this ancient story, allow me to welcome you to the channel. To any newcomers joining us for the first time, hello, and to all our returning listeners, welcome back. It is very good to have you with us again on this quiet evening. As always, this channel is completely ad-free, so you can settle in without any interruptions breaking the peace. You have enough noise in your daily life. You certainly do not need any more of it here. And that is thanks to those wonderful souls who support us through Patreon, YouTube memberships, and the occasional donation. All the links are down below in the description if you would like to be one of them. But truly, just by being here, by listening, by relaxing with us tonight, you are helping this channel grow. So give the video a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you have not yet. And now, let us gently drift back in time to a world that no eyes have seen for 8,000 years. Well, imagine yourself standing on a low hill, somewhere in the middle of what is now the North Sea. But the sea is not here yet. Instead, a wide green plain stretches out around you as far as your eyes can see. To the east, gentle rolling meadows fade into distant forests. To the west, the glimmer of a great river winds its way through the reeds. The air smells of damp earth and pine, and the wind carries the sound of birdsong, of distant animals, of leaves rustling in the willow trees. There are no roads here, no fences, no borders, no cities. Just the raw, untouched world as it was in the days before civilization began to take shape. This is Doggerland, roughly 10,000 years ago, at the tail end of the last ice age. A vast and living landscape that once formed the very heart of northwestern Europe. You see, when we look at a modern map, Britain is an island. It sits apart, separated from the European continent by the English Channel and the North Sea. To most of us, this seems permanent, unchanging, as if it must always have been so. But the Earth has a longer memory than we do, and for most of human history, Britain was not an island at all. It was joined to the mainland by an enormous plain, a lowland that spread across what is now the North Sea, connecting modern England to the Netherlands, to Denmark, to Germany. This plain was Doggerland, and it was not some barren wasteland or frozen tundra. Not at all. It was a rich, fertile country. Some archaeologists believe it may have been one of the most productive hunting grounds in all of Europe during the Mesolithic era. A true paradise for the hunter-gatherer peoples who lived upon it. The name Doggerland, by the way, comes from a place called the Dogger Bank. That is a large sandbank in the North Sea, sitting roughly halfway between England and Denmark. Fishermen have known about the Dogger Bank for centuries because it is one of the great fishing grounds of the North Sea. In fact, the name itself likely derives from an old Dutch word, dogger, referring to a type of fishing boat that was once used there. But it was only in the 20th century that scientists began to realize the Dogger Bank was not just a shallow patch of sea. It was the last remaining trace of a much larger world, the high ground of a drowned continent, if you will. And so in the 1990s, a British archaeologist named Bryony Coles gave this lost world the name we use today. Doggerland, and she began, along with many others, to map out its lost geography, piecing together what this vanished landscape had once looked like. Well, to understand how Doggerland came to be and how it disappeared, we have to travel much further back in time, all the way to the last ice age. About 20,000 years ago, the Earth was a very different place. Enormous sheets of ice covered northern Europe, stretching from Scandinavia down across the British Isles. So much of the world's water was locked up in these vast glaciers that the sea levels dropped dramatically, in some places by more than 100 meters below where they sit today. And as the seas receded, Huge areas of what is now ocean floor were exposed, dry and open to the sky. The North Sea Basin, that great shallow bowl between Britain and mainland Europe, was one such place. It was left high and dry, a vast expanse of land where before there had been water. But of course, at the peak of the Ice Age, it was too cold for much life. This was a frozen wilderness of ice and stone, whipped by bitter winds off the glaciers. Not the sort of place you would want to build a home. But then, slowly, the world began to warm. Around 15,000 years ago, the great ice sheets started to retreat, and as they melted back toward the poles, the land they left behind gradually came to life. Tundra gave way to grassland. Grassland gave way to scattered woodland. Rivers began to carve their way through the newly thawed soil, flowing down toward the sea. And with the land came the animals. Great herds of reindeer at first, then red deer, wild horses, aurochs, wild boar. Beavers built their dams in the streams. Wolves and lynx prowled the forests. Salmon and eel filled the rivers. And where the animals went, well, the people followed. It is believed that human beings first walked onto Doggerland around 12 or 13,000 years ago. Small bands of hunter-gatherers coming north as the world grew warmer. They were tough, resilient people, well adapted to a hard life on the move. And what they found on Doggerland must have seemed like a wonderland to them. A land of plenty, because Doggerland was not just fertile, it was also sheltered. Sitting low between the higher ground of Britain and the continent, it was protected from the harshest weather, and so it developed its own climate, warmer and wetter than the surrounding uplands. This meant richer vegetation, moory game, better fishing, everything a hunter-gatherer could ever hope to find in their world. Over the following thousands of years, generations of families came to live on this land, not just to pass through, but to settle, to build lives. And they left traces of themselves behind. Traces that, incredibly, we can still find today. Fishermen trawling the North Sea have for centuries been pulling strange objects up in their nets. Fragments of bone, worked pieces of antler, mysterious tools shaped from flint. For a long time, nobody quite knew what to make of these finds. Some assumed they had washed out to sea from the coast. Others simply threw them back into the water without a second thought. But eventually, archaeologists began to take notice, and what they realized was staggering. These were not modern objects. They were not medieval or Roman. They were ancient, Mesolithic, tens of thousands of years old in some cases. They were being pulled up from the sea floor because that sea floor had once been solid ground, and people had once lived there. One of the most famous of these discoveries came in 1931, when a fishing trawler working the North Sea pulled up something unexpected in its nets. It was a small pointed object, delicately carved, with barbs along its edges. When scientists examined it, they realized what it was: a spear point, a hunting weapon made of antler, worked with great skill. And when they dated it, well, they found it was around 13,000 years old. 13,000 years. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere out there, beneath the waves, a hunter had once carried this spear. He had walked through the woods and grasslands of Doggerland. He had hunted with it. Perhaps he had used it to bring down a great red deer to feed his family. And then, one way or another, he had lost it. Dropped it, perhaps. Or left it in the ribs of some animal that later drifted away. And for 13,000 years it had lain undisturbed, until a modern fishing net had scooped it up and carried it back to the surface. It was, quite literally, a message from a lost world. And this was only the beginning. Since that first discovery, thousands more artifacts have come up from the North Sea. Fragments of mammoth tusk, bones of long extinct animals, human skulls, in some cases, tens of thousands of years old. Little pieces of a picture that scientists have been slowly assembling, ever so patiently, ever so carefully. And what that picture reveals is nothing short of remarkable. Doggerland was not just a bridge that people crossed to get from one place to another. It was a home, a homeland, a place where whole communities lived out their entire lives without ever setting foot on what we would now call England or the Netherlands or Denmark. To them, Doggerland was the world. And they had no way of knowing that their world was, even as they lived in it, slowly and steadily beginning to drown. Because you see, as much as the melting of the ice had gifted them this land, it was also, at the very same time, quietly plotting to take it away. Every year, as more of the great glaciers ran into the sea, the waters rose, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a few centimeters in a lifetime perhaps, but over centuries, over millennia, those centimeters added up. The coastlines crept inward. The rivers grew brackish where they met the encroaching tides. Marshes formed where meadows had been. And in the far distance, the sea, patient and inexorable, was coming for Doggerland. It would take thousands of years to finish the job. But in the end, the water would win. And the land, along with everyone and everything upon it, would be lost forever beneath the waves. But that story, that great tragic story, is one we shall begin to unfold in the next section. Well, to truly understand the slow drowning of Doggerland, we must first come to know the people who lived upon it, because they were not simply anonymous figures moving across a map. They were living, breathing human beings just like you and me. They laughed, they wept, they fell in love, they mourned their dead. They had names, though we shall never know them. They had languages, though we shall never hear them spoken. And they built a way of life on this vanished land that lasted, in one form or another, for thousands upon thousands of years, far longer than most of the great civilizations that would come after them. So who were these people of Doggerland? What did their days look like? What did they eat? Where did they sleep? And how did they see the world around them? Well, archaeologists refer to them broadly as Mesolithic peoples. That is a term derived from the Greek, meaning quite literally Middle Stone Age. It refers to the period between the end of the last ice age and the beginnings of farming, a stretch of time that in northwestern Europe lasted from roughly 10,000 years ago until around 6,000 years ago. And it was during this Middle Stone Age that Doggerland reached its peak. Its forests were thick, its rivers ran clear, its wildlife was abundant, and its human inhabitants, though few in number by our modern standards, were skilled and resourceful beyond what we might imagine. They were not primitive, not in any meaningful sense of the word. They were, in fact, masters of their environment, with a knowledge of the land and its rhythms that any modern survivalist would envy. You see, a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer had to be many things all at once. He had to be a tracker, able to read the passage of animals through leaf and mud and broken twig. He had to be a craftsman, able to work flint into blades of astonishing sharpness, to shape bone and antler into hooks and needles and spearheads. He had to be a builder, able to construct shelters from wood and hide and reed. He had to be a fisherman, a forager, a healer of small wounds. He had to know which plants were safe to eat and which would kill him. He had to know when to move and when to stay, when the deer would migrate, when the salmon would run, when the berries would ripen on the bush. And all of this knowledge, all of it, was carried in the mind and passed down through stories and demonstration from one generation to the next. There was no writing, no books, no schools, only the elders teaching the young by the fireside, night after night, year after year. And of course, it was not just the men who held this knowledge. The women of Doggerland were every bit as vital to their communities. They gathered plants, roots, and berries. They wove baskets and made cordage from plant fibers. They prepared hides and stitched them into clothing. They tended the children and taught them the ways of the world. In many Mesolithic societies, it is now believed that women contributed the majority of the daily food supply through their gathering. While the hunt provided moments of feast, it was the steady stream of nuts and greens and shellfish and roots brought back to camp that kept a family alive through the long, lean stretches of the year. Everyone had a place. Everyone contributed. And in such small, tight-knit communities, the loss of any one person would have been felt deeply by all. Now, we know something of how these people lived because of the settlements that have been found, both on land and, tantalizingly, beneath the sea. On the coasts of what is now Denmark and England, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of Mesolithic camps that once bordered ancient Doggerland. At sites like Star Carr in Yorkshire, for example, they have found the traces of a large seasonal settlement dating back some 11,000 years. Wooden platforms built out over an ancient lakeshore, the bones of red deer and elk and beaver, antler headdresses likely used in some kind of ritual or ceremony, even the earliest known example of carpentry in Europe in the form of a split timber trackway. All of this suggests that the people of this time and place were not merely wandering nomads. They returned to the same places year after year. They built structures meant to last. They had ceremonies. They had traditions. They had, in every meaningful sense, a culture. And their homes, though modest, were more than adequate for the climate they lived in. Picture a dwelling, if you will. Small and round, perhaps 3 or 4 meters across, made of a framework of bent saplings lashed together at the top, covered in a layer of reeds or bark or animal hides. A hearth in the center, where a small fire burned day and night, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Bedding of straw and furs along the edges. Tools hung from the rafters, perhaps a smoked salmon or a haunch of deer curing above the flames. In the doorway, a hide flap that could be tied shut against the wind and rain. It was not luxury, but it was warm, it was dry, it was safe. And when the season turned, when it was time to move on to summer fishing grounds or autumn hunting camps, the people would simply pack up their belongings, gather their children, and set out across the land to the next familiar place. And the empty shelter would remain behind, waiting patiently for their return. Now, the diet of the people of Doggerland would have been remarkably varied. Far more varied, in fact, than the diet of many people who came after them in later ages. In spring, they would gather the young shoots of nettles, wild garlic, and dandelions. They would collect birds' eggs from nests hidden in the marshes. In summer, they would fish the rivers for salmon and trout, spear eels in the shallows, gather the freshwater mussels that grew thick along the banks. In autumn, they would harvest hazelnuts by the sackful. Hazelnuts, in fact, were a staple. Whole ancient pits full of roasted hazelnut shells had been found across Mesolithic sites, evidence of just how important this humble food was to their survival. In winter, when the leaner months came, they would rely on stored nuts, dried fish, smoked meat, and whatever fresh game they could bring in from the hunt. They ate wild boar and deer and beaver. They ate ducks and geese from the wetlands. They gathered oysters and cockles along the coastal edges. Their bones, when we examine them today, show they were generally well fed, strong, healthy, free from many of the diseases and deficiencies that would later plague settled farming populations. Well, that is not to say that life on Doggerland was easy. It was not. It was hard in ways that we in the modern world can barely comprehend. There were no doctors. A broken leg could mean death. A bad tooth, an infected wound, a difficult childbirth, any of these could carry a person off in the prime of their life. Child mortality was high. Many Barbies did not live to see their first year, and even the healthiest adults rarely lived past their 50s. It was a life measured in shorter spans, but perhaps also in richer moments, if that makes any sense. Every day was a struggle, but every day also carried meaning. And when a good hunt came in, or a child took their first steps, or the summer sun warmed the wide plains after a long, dark winter, there must have been a joy in it, a gratitude. A sense that the world, for all its harshness, was also very much alive. And they were not alone in that world. Well, not just as human communities, I mean. The land teemed with life. Great herds of red deer moved through the woodlands in autumn, their antlers clattering against branches, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. Aurochs, the mighty wild cattle that were the ancestors of our modern cows, grazed in the meadows. Enormous beasts, nearly twice the size of a modern bull, with sweeping curved horns that could gore a man to death in an instant. Wild boars rooted through the forest floor. Beavers built their lodges in the slow-flowing streams, felling trees and creating pools where fish gathered in abundance. Wolves ranged the plains in packs. Brown bears fished the salmon runs. And overhead, the skies were filled with birds, cranes and storks and swans. Great flocks of geese darkening the sky at migration time. Sea eagles nesting in the highest trees. It was, in every sense, a wilderness, untamed, untouched, pristine, a world before mankind had begun to reshape it in earnest. And in the midst of all this, the people of Doggerland went about their lives, following the rhythms of the seasons, tending their fires, telling their stories under skies full of stars. They knew nothing of what lay beyond the horizon. They knew nothing of the rise and fall of civilizations. They knew nothing of Egypt or Rome or the empires that would one day dominate the earth. Their world, as far as they were concerned, was the world. The rivers they knew, the forests they hunted, the coasts where they gathered shells. And they lived in it fully, wholly, without ever suspecting that their world was under threat. Because the sea, that patient enemy, was creeping closer with every passing century. At first, the changes would have been so slow as to be invisible, a slightly higher tide line, perhaps, than the elders remembered from their youth, a marsh appearing where once there had been dry ground, a river mouth moving inland ever so gradually over the span of generations. Nothing to raise alarm, nothing to send a family fleeing from their ancestral hunting grounds. But over centuries, the accumulation became undeniable. Old campsites, high and dry in the memory of great-grandparents, were now underwater. Islands appeared where there had been hills. Ancient paths across the land were swallowed by rising streams. And still, the people adapted. They moved inland when they had to. They shifted their settlements. They found new places to fish and hunt, because that is what human beings do. We adapt, we endure, we carry on. But there is a limit to what any people can endure. And for the people of Doggerland, that limit was approaching. Slowly, silently, but approaching all the same. And in the next section, we shall see just how their world began to change. Well, the sea, as we have said, was always coming. Ever since the last great ice sheets began to melt some 15,000 years ago, the waters of the world had been rising, slowly at first, then in fits and starts, sometimes faster than at other times. Every century, more water was added to the oceans. Every century, more land was lost around the edges. And by the time the Mesolithic peoples had established their communities on Doggerland, this process had already been underway for many thousands of years. They just did not know it. They could not have known it. To them, the world was as it had always been. The sea was where the sea was, and the land was where the land was. And it did not occur to them, most likely, that either had ever been any different. But the world was, quietly and steadily, transforming beneath their feet. And to understand just how dramatic this transformation was, we must look at the numbers. When the last ice age reached its peak, around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. Try to picture that for a moment. That is the height of a 40-story building. All of that water locked away in ice sheets, kilometers thick, covering vast portions of the northern hemisphere. And as those ice sheets melted, all of it, well, most of it, ended up in the oceans. Century by century, millennium by millennium, sea levels crept upward, and the world we know today began, ever so slowly, to take shape. By around 10,000 years ago, when Doggerland was in its prime, sea levels were still perhaps 40 or 50 meters lower than they are now. That still left plenty of land exposed. The southern coast of Doggerland, where the English Channel now runs, was wide open plain. The Thames and the Rhine, two of Europe's great rivers, did not empty separately into the sea as they do today. Instead, they met somewhere out in the middle of what is now the North Sea, joining together in a single enormous river system that flowed southward through the Great Plain and out to the distant Atlantic. Imagine standing on the banks of that combined river. It would have been vast, perhaps miles wide in places, slow and dark and heavy with silt. A great artery of water flowing through the heart of the drowned land, teeming with fish, lined with reed beds and marshes, home to countless waterbirds and beavers and otters. It must have been a sight to behold, a place of extraordinary abundance for the people who lived along its banks. And along those banks, the people did indeed live. Archaeologists studying the sea floor of the modern North Sea have found evidence of ancient settlements clustered along what would have been the courses of these prehistoric rivers, because rivers, then as now, were the lifelines of the land. They provided fresh water, they provided fish, they provided highways for travel by boat, and they attracted game, which came to drink at their edges. So wherever the river ran, the people followed. Their camps dotted the shorelines. Their canoes, hollowed out from single great logs, glided across the surface. Their children swam and played in the shallows on warm summer days. It was, for all its harshness, a good life. And it might have gone on that way, unchanged, for thousands more years, had the ice not been so relentless in its melting. Because far to the north, in what is now Canada and Greenland and Scandinavia, the great remaining ice sheets were breaking apart. And every summer, more of that ice ran into the sea. Not just slow trickles, but sometimes catastrophic bursts. Vast dammed lakes of meltwater, held back by walls of ice, would suddenly break through and send enormous surges of fresh water flooding into the oceans. One such event, known to geologists as meltwater pulse 1A, occurred around 14,000 years ago. During this event, sea levels rose by perhaps 16 or 20 meters over just a few centuries. That is an extraordinary rate, fast enough that the changes would have been noticeable even within a single lifetime. And it was not the last such event. There were more to come. Some of them, we now believe, sudden and violent enough that they would have transformed the coastlines of the world within the span of a single generation. Meanwhile, on Doggerland, the effects were already being felt. As the sea rose, the low-lying plains along the edges of the land began to flood. Salt water pushed inland up the estuaries. The freshwater marshes turned brackish, then salty, then finally became part of the open sea itself. Whole regions that had once been rich hunting grounds slowly became waterlogged, then submerged. The people who lived on those lands had to move. And when they moved inland, toward the higher ground, toward the central hills of Doggerland, and eventually toward what is now Britain or the European mainland. This must have caused, we can only imagine, considerable disruption. Ancient hunting territories, held perhaps by the same family group for hundreds of years, were being abandoned. Sacred places where ancestors had been buried were being lost beneath the waves. And the survivors, moving inland, would have found themselves crowding into territory already occupied by other groups. Whether these encounters were peaceful or whether they led to conflict, we cannot say for certain. But it would be surprising indeed if there had not been at least some tension, because human beings, then as now, do not always welcome newcomers into their homelands. And it was not just the coasts that were changing. The whole character of Doggerland was shifting. As the climate grew warmer and wetter, the vegetation began to change. The open grasslands of the early period, which had supported such vast herds of reindeer and wild horses, were being replaced by dense forests. Oak and elm and hazel and lime spread across the land. The great herd animals of the Ice Age retreated northward, following the cooler climates, and in their place came smaller, more solitary creatures. Red deer, roe deer, wild boar, aurochs, animals that were harder to hunt in large numbers, that required different techniques and different weapons. The people of Doggerland, adaptable as they were, changed with the times. They developed smaller, more precise hunting tools. Microliths, they are called. Tiny flint blades, cleverly hafted into arrows and spears that could be used to bring down a single deer at close range in the forest, rather than to slaughter a whole herd on the open plain. Well, this shift from grassland to forest, from herd hunting to woodland hunting, was itself a kind of quiet revolution. It changed the way people lived. It changed the sizes of the groups that could live together in one place. It changed the routes they traveled and the seasons they moved in. And it happened, so far as we can tell, over just a few thousand years, which sounds like a long time to us, but is really only a blink in the eye of the earth. It is a testament to the flexibility of these Mesolithic peoples that they weathered such profound environmental change without vanishing altogether. They simply adapted, and they carried on. But the sea would not be so accommodating. Around 8,500 years ago, Doggerland was still a substantial territory, much reduced from its former size, yes. Great portions of it had been lost already. The southern plains, where the ancient Thames Rhine River had flowed, were now largely underwater. The northern uplands had shrunk, but what remained was still a considerable landmass, a large low-lying island, or perhaps a peninsula, still connected in some places to the mainland. The Dogger Hills, that high ground that would one day become the Dogger Bank, still stood proudly above the surrounding waters, and people still lived upon them. They fished, they hunted, they gathered, they buried their dead in the ancestral ground. They probably had no notion whatsoever that their world was in its final chapter, because by this point the truth is, Doggerland was doomed. The sea was too close now. The waters had risen too high. There was no going back. Even if the melting had stopped altogether that very day, and even if sea levels had held steady from that moment on, Doggerland as a functioning homeland was already fading. The rich hunting grounds of the past were gone. The great river was gone. Much of the population had already moved elsewhere, scattered to the shores of what would become England and the Low Countries. The Doggerland that remained was a much diminished place, a shadow of its former self, still inhabited, yes, still valued by those who lived there, but no longer the vast, teeming heartland it had once been. It was a land in decline, and it was a decline that could only end one way. And yet, even in decline, the people carried on, because what else could they do? They knew the land they had. They knew its rivers and its shorelines. They knew where the good fishing spots were and where the deer trails ran through the woods. They knew where their grandparents were buried. And they clung to what they had, as any people would. They rebuilt their camps in higher ground. They pulled their boats up further from the tideline than they had used to. They watched the sea a little more warily than their ancestors had done. But mostly they lived. They laughed. They loved. They raised their children and told them the old stories by the fire at night. Perhaps some of those stories, by now, had begun to hint at what was happening. Perhaps the elders spoke of the old times, when the sea had been further away, when there had been more land. Perhaps they spoke of vanished places, of camps their own grandparents had known, that were now beneath the waves. It is not hard to imagine such tales being told. It is not hard to imagine the young ones listening, wide-eyed, half believing and half not, as the elder pointed toward the western horizon and said, "There was once a great forest where now there is only sea." But no story, no memory, no old warning could have prepared the people of Doggerland for what was coming. Because even as they slept in their shelters, even as they went about their days in what remained of their homeland, a catastrophe was gathering. Not the slow, steady rise of the sea that they had come to accept and endure, but something far worse, something sudden, something violent. Something that would, in a matter of hours, tear away what was left of Doggerland and change the face of Northern Europe forever. And in the next section, we shall speak of that terrible day, the day the wave came. Well, to speak of the wave that came, we must first travel far to the north, far beyond Doggerland, far beyond even the Mesolithic peoples who lived upon it. We must travel to the coast of what is now Norway, to a stretch of underwater seabed that in modern times bears a name given to it by geologists, the Storegga Slide. Storegga, in Norwegian, means quite simply the Great Edge, and it is called that because along this stretch of the continental shelf, the sea floor drops away suddenly and dramatically into the deep waters of the Norwegian Sea. It is a vast underwater cliff, kilometers of steep slope, plunging down into darkness. And beneath the surface of the water, hidden from human eyes for thousands of years, this cliff held a secret, a dangerous, unstable secret. A great mass of sediment piled up on the edge of the shelf, poised precariously, waiting for the moment when it would let go and slide down into the abyss. You see, throughout the Ice Age and the long, slow thaw that followed, sediments had been building up along the Norwegian coast, silt washed down by rivers, debris carried out by melting glaciers, fine layers of sand and clay deposited year after year, generation after generation. Over thousands of years, these sediments had piled up into an enormous underwater deposit hanging off the edge of the continental shelf. And within this deposit, hidden away in its lower layers, were pockets of frozen methane gas, gas that had been trapped in the sediments during the cold ages, held in place by pressure and by cold. But as the seas warmed after the Ice Age, some of that trapped methane began to loosen. The seabed began to become less stable, and somewhere, deep beneath the surface, in the slow, patient darkness of the deep, the whole vast mass of sediment was becoming more and more precariously balanced, waiting for a trigger, waiting for something to send it plunging into the deep. That trigger, when it came, may well have been an earthquake, a tremor along the Norwegian coast, of the sort that occurs from time to time in that part of the world. We cannot know exactly what set it off, but we know when it happened. We know because the traces of that great catastrophe were preserved in the mud and stone of many coastlines around the North Sea. Layers of sand and marine debris deposited in inland places where they had no business being. Left there by an event so enormous, so violent, that it stripped away the shorelines and pushed the sea kilometers inland in the space of an afternoon. Well, when scientists dated these layers, they found they all matched. All of them pointed to the same moment in time, a moment roughly 8,200 years ago, give or take a few decades, the moment when the Storegga Slide let go. And when it let go, well, it let go with a fury that is almost impossible to imagine. Some 3,000 cubic kilometers of sediment gave way at once. 3,000 cubic kilometers. Try to picture that if you can. It is roughly the volume of Iceland. all of it tumbling down the slope of the continental shelf in one great catastrophic slide. Now, if this had happened on dry land, it would have been terrible enough. A landslide of that scale would have flattened everything for hundreds of kilometers around. But it did not happen on land. It happened underwater. And when a mass of that size moves through water, the water has to move as well. And the water it displaces, well, it becomes a tsunami. Not the kind of small tsunami you might see on the news. Not even the kind that would devastate a coastal town. This was a tsunami of a different order altogether. A wave, or rather a series of waves, of truly staggering proportions. And they began racing outward from the Norwegian coast at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Silent, unstoppable, invisible in the open sea, and bearing down, whether it knew it or not, upon what remained of Doggerland. For the people of Doggerland, that morning would have begun like any other. We can only imagine it. A cool early summer day, perhaps, mist rising from the marshes, smoke curling up from the cooking fires of the small settlements scattered across the remaining hills and shorelines, children playing in the shallows, men out in canoes, checking their nets or hunting the waterbirds among the reeds, women gathering shellfish along the coast at low tide, elders sitting by the fires, weaving cordage or working flint, the ordinary business of a Mesolithic morning, nothing to hint at what was coming, nothing to give any warning. The sky was clear, the sea was calm, the birds sang in the willows and the wind moved gently through the trees. And then, somewhere out on the horizon, something changed. Perhaps some of them saw it first. The people on the higher ground looking out toward the distant sea, they may have noticed something strange. The waters out at the far edge of vision were receding, not in the ordinary way of a tide going out, but quickly, alarmingly. The shoreline was pulling back. Fish were left flapping in the exposed mud. Great stretches of seabed, never before seen, lay glistening under the sun. Some of the people may have run down to gather the stranded fish, thinking it a strange gift from the gods. Others may have simply stood and stared, puzzled and uneasy, because instinctively, deep in their bones, they would have known that something was wrong. The sea does not behave this way, not without reason. And then on the horizon they would have seen it, a line, a dark line, at first no thicker than a hair, stretching across the whole width of the sea, growing, rising, approaching. It would have taken them a moment, perhaps, to understand what they were looking at, because they had never seen anything like it. But as it drew closer, it would have become horribly clear. It was a wall of water, a wave, taller than any tree, taller than any hill they knew, rolling toward them with the speed of a running horse. And behind that first wave, there was another, and another after that, a whole series of them, each one racing to overtake the last. Marching in from the north like an army of the sea itself, come to reclaim the land at last. We do not know exactly how tall the Storegga wave was by the time it reached Doggerland. Different parts of the coast would have been hit with different intensities. Along the coast of what is now Scotland, geological evidence suggests waves of perhaps 10 meters in height. Along the coast of what is now Norway, in some places, the water may have reached 20 or 30 meters high. It is possible that in the shallow waters around Doggerland, the wave slowed and grew even taller as it approached, perhaps 10 meters, perhaps more. But whatever the exact height, the effect would have been catastrophic, because Doggerland by this time was a low-lying land. Its hills were modest. Its plains stretched out barely above the waterline. And when a wave that tall came racing in, there was nowhere to run. There was no high ground to reach. There was only the water, coming and coming, and there was no stopping it. The wave would have hit the coast with a roar that could be heard for many kilometers. Trees would have been ripped from the earth, their roots torn free and hurled inland like twigs. Shelters, the little round dwellings of hide and reed, would have vanished in an instant. Small boats, out on the water, would have been snapped and tossed like driftwood. And the people, well, the people would have had almost no chance at all. Some may have tried to run, scrambling toward whatever higher ground they could see. But the wave was faster than any runner. It swept over the land in a great churning brown flood, carrying with it a horrifying debris of broken trees, splintered wood, mud, drowned animals, and everything else it had picked up along the way. Whole communities, whole families, whole generations of accumulated knowledge and story and love would have been wiped away in a matter of minutes, and it would not have been just one wave. The tsunami came in as a series. Each wave slightly smaller than the last, perhaps, but each still terrible in its own right. The water would surge in, then retreat, then surge in again, and each retreat would drag with it whatever the previous wave had not yet claimed. Bodies would be pulled out to sea. Belongings would be swept away. Camps that had stood in the same place for generations would be scoured down to bare earth. And when the water finally settled, hours later, the survivors, if there were any, would have looked out upon a world unrecognizable. Where there had been meadows, there was now open water. Where there had been familiar hills, there was mud and debris and wreckage. Where their family and their neighbors and their children had been, there was silence. We can only guess at how many people died that day. Doggerland, by this point, was thinly populated compared to its prime. Perhaps only a few thousand people still lived on what remained of it. Perhaps only a few hundred, spread across the coasts and hills of that shrinking land. But whatever the number, a great many of them would have been killed. Some estimates suggest that the majority of Doggerland's remaining inhabitants perished in the Storegga event. Only those who happened to be on the highest ground, or those who by luck or fate were away from the coast that day, would have survived. And even for them, the world they returned to would have been utterly transformed. Their homes gone, their loved ones gone, their food stores gone, their canoes gone. And around them, the sea, which had always been retreating in the memory of the old ones, now pressed in closer than it ever had before. Well, some scholars believe that the Storegga tsunami was the effective end of Doggerland as a functioning homeland, not the absolute end. That would come later as the sea continued to rise, but the moment after which Doggerland ceased to be a place where meaningful human communities could persist. Because the survivors of that day, well, they would have fled. There would have been no reason to stay. The hunting grounds were destroyed. The rivers were choked with debris. The land itself was scarred and salt-poisoned. And so those who lived through the wave gathered what little they could and left. They took to their boats, if they still had them, or they walked across the last remaining land bridges. Some went east, to what is now the Netherlands and Denmark. Others went west, to what is now England. They brought with them their stories, their memories, their grief, and they carried, whether they knew it or not, the last living traces of a lost world. A world that in the coming centuries would slip fully beneath the waves and vanish from the memory of humankind. And in the next section, we shall follow what became of it as the sea completed its long, slow victory. Well, the survivors of the Storegga wave, we can only imagine what those first days after the disaster must have been like. They would have wandered dazed among the wreckage, searching for kin, calling names into the wind, finding, more often than not, only silence in return. The land itself would have been transformed beyond recognition. Familiar landmarks torn away, trees that had stood for centuries lying uprooted and broken in tangled heaps. The bodies of drowned animals, deer and wild boar and horses, scattered across the mud where the wave had left them. And the bodies, too, of neighbors and friends and loved ones. Some found, many not, because the sea had taken what it had taken, and much of it, well, much of it would never be seen again. For those who remained, decisions had to be made, quickly, because the coming weeks would be terribly hard. The stored food was gone, washed away or spoiled by salt. The tools and weapons that had taken lifetimes to craft were lost. The boats that would have let them fish for new food were smashed. The seed heads and berry bushes that lined the familiar gathering paths were buried under mud and debris. Everything they had depended upon, everything that had sustained their communities for generations, was gone in the space of a single afternoon. And winter, though perhaps still months away, was always coming. Always. In the north of Europe, in the Mesolithic world, a family that could not prepare for winter was a family that would not survive it. And so the survivors gathered together, as human beings will, and they made the decisions that survivors have always had to make. Some, perhaps the very old, or those too grief-stricken to move, chose to stay where they were, to rebuild what they could, to hope that the land would recover, that the fish would return, that the deer would come back to the coastal forests. And perhaps some of them did survive that first year, but most did not, because Doggerland had already been struggling before the wave came. The rising seas had already eaten away at its edges. The forests had already been shifting. The population had already been thinning. The Storegga event was not, in the end, the whole story of the drowning. It was the final blow. the last great shove, and the land, wounded and broken, could no longer support the life it once had. Others made the harder choice. They packed what little they had, gathered what family they could find, and set out. Some went eastward, following the retreating coastlines toward what is now Denmark and the Netherlands. Others went westward, toward the higher ground that would one day be known as England and Scotland. Still others may have paddled north, up along the coast of what would become the Norwegian shore. Wherever they went, they carried with them what they could of their old life, perhaps a favorite flint blade, perhaps a small pouch of hazelnuts, perhaps a bone flute that had once played beside the fires of their vanished home. And in their minds, in their hearts, they carried the memories of everything they had lost. Their dead, their homes, their homeland itself. And these memories, we suspect, would not have faded quickly. They would have been passed down, told and retold around new fires in new places to children who had never known Doggerland and could only try to imagine it. A land beneath the sea, a land where the grandmothers had once walked. It is a striking thought, is it not? That somewhere out there, in the oral traditions of the Mesolithic peoples of northern Europe, there may once have been stories of Doggerland. Stories of the Great Flood, stories of the day the wave came, stories of the land that was lost. We shall never hear those stories, of course. They were told in languages long since dead, by people who left no writing behind. And yet it is not impossible that echoes of them survived. Some scholars have suggested that the ancient flood myths of many European cultures, the tales of great deluges that drown whole worlds, may have their deepest roots in memories like these. Memories of real drownings, real vanished lands, real ancestors who watched their world disappear. It is speculation, of course. We cannot prove any such thing, but it is a compelling thought that the story of Doggerland, though the land itself was lost, may have lived on for thousands of years in the stories people told each other in the dark, a whisper of a memory, a distant echo of the day the sea came home. Well, whatever the survivors carried with them into their new lives, one thing is clear. Doggerland itself was finished. What remained of it after the Storegga wave was too damaged, too diminished, and too vulnerable to the still rising seas to remain habitable for long. Over the following few centuries, the sea continued its patient work. Every year, a little more land was lost. Every generation, the coastlines of what had once been Doggerland shrank a little further. The lower plains, still visible above the water immediately after the tsunami, gradually became first marshes, then mudflats, then open sea. The middle hills, where a few stubborn communities may have tried to cling on, became islands. And then, slowly, those islands too began to shrink, their edges eaten away by the tides, their fresh water sources overwhelmed by salt, their trees dying as the ground beneath them turned briny. By around 7,500 years ago, only the highest ground of Doggerland was still above the waves. A cluster of low islands, perhaps, still standing in the middle of the widening North Sea. And these islands would have been strange, lonely places, cut off from the mainland, home only to the last few hardy souls who refused to leave or who could not. They would have fished the surrounding waters. They would have hunted the birds that nested on their shores. But their lives would have been increasingly narrow, increasingly precarious, increasingly small. And when the last of them died, or when at last they too gathered their belongings and paddled away toward the distant mainland, Doggerland became truly empty, a place with no people, a place with no memory of itself, a place where only the wind and the waves remained. By perhaps 7,000 years ago, even the last islands were gone. The sea had won. Where there had once been a great and fertile land, home to thousands of people over thousands of years, there was now only the open water of the North Sea. The waves rolled unbroken from Norway to England. The fish swam over what had once been meadows. And on the sea floor, in the darkness far below, the old land lay silent. The remains of ancient forests were slowly buried in silt. The bones of animals long dead settled into the mud. The tools and hearths and buried dead of the Mesolithic peoples sank deeper and deeper into the sediment, waiting for a time when they might be found again, though no one who knew about them would live to see that day. And so for thousands of years, Doggerland was forgotten, not just as a physical place, but as an idea, as a memory. Whatever stories had once been told about it faded from human minds. The languages that had described it died out. The peoples who had once lived upon it were absorbed into other populations, their bloodlines mingling with those of the peoples of coastal England, coastal Denmark, coastal Germany, and beyond. Their descendants, over generations, forgot where their ancestors had come from. They no longer knew that once, long ago, there had been a great land in the middle of the sea. They looked out at the North Sea and saw only sea, as if it had always been there, as if it had never been anything else. And this forgetting lasted, well, it lasted almost until modern times. Through the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, and the Roman period, and the great migrations that followed. Through the age of the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans. Through the medieval period, and the Renaissance, and the age of exploration. Through all of it, Doggerland lay hidden beneath the waves, its very existence unknown to the peoples living on the coasts around it. The Romans, when they conquered Britain, thought of the sea as an ancient and eternal barrier. The Vikings, when they crossed it in their longships, saw only the endless northern waters. The medieval fishermen, when they cast their nets over the Dogger Bank, wondered perhaps why the fishing was so good in that particular spot. But they did not suspect that the sandy shallows beneath their boats were the tops of ancient hills, or that people had once lived there. Well, it was really only in the last few centuries that any inkling of the truth began to emerge. And it began, appropriately enough, with the fishermen themselves. Because as the fishing industry in the North Sea grew during the 18th and 19th centuries, more and more strange objects began to come up in the nets. Bones, mostly. Old bones. Some so old that they had turned to stone, hard and heavy, and like anything a modern animal had ever grown. Others clearly ancient but recognizable. The teeth of great extinct beasts, the tusks of mammoths, the antlers of animals no longer found in Europe. For a long time, no one quite knew what to make of these finds. Some assumed they had washed out to sea from ancient river beds on the coast. Others tossed them back into the water without a second thought. But a few began to save them. Curious naturalists and gentlemen collectors, in the age of scientific awakening, began to gather these bones and study them. And slowly, very slowly, a strange picture began to emerge, because these were not sea creatures. These were land animals. Mammoths and rhinos and deer and horses and aurochs, animals that had lived on solid ground, breathing air, walking on grass. But their bones were coming up from the middle of the sea. How could this be? For a long time, the answer was baffling. Some suggested the bones had drifted from distant shorelines. Others suggested they had been carried by ancient rivers. But by the late 19th century, a few scholars began to entertain a more radical possibility. What if the animals had lived where their bones were being found? What if the sea floor of the North Sea had, at some time in the distant past, been dry land? What if there had been, in the days before recorded history, a country there that no living person had ever seen? It was a bold idea, a strange idea, and it was, though nobody quite knew it yet, the beginning of the rediscovery of Doggerland. And in the next section, we shall follow how that rediscovery came to be. How the modern world, after so many thousands of years, began at last to remember the land that had been drowned. Well, the rediscovery of Doggerland, as with so many great scientific stories, did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, piece by piece, in fits and starts, spread across many decades and many countries. And it was, in truth, an accidental rediscovery, because no one set out to find a lost land beneath the North Sea. No one had reason to look for one. The idea would have seemed absurd to most educated people in the 19th century. The North Sea had always been the North Sea, so far as anyone knew. It was one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. It had been mapped and charted and sailed across countless times. What could possibly be hidden beneath such well-known waters? And yet, hidden it was. And bit by bit, the evidence began to accumulate, whether the scholars of the time were ready for it or not. The first significant clue, as we mentioned, came from the fishermen. In the 1840s and 1850s, as the great fishing fleets of England and the Low Countries expanded their operations into the deeper waters of the North Sea, more and more strange objects began appearing in their nets. Bones, mostly. But not just any bones. Enormous bones. Tusks the size of a man's arm. Great curved femurs. Massive teeth with heavy grinding ridges. The fishermen, who were not typically men of science, but who knew their business well enough, recognized that these were nothing they had ever seen before. Some assumed they were the remains of ancient sea monsters, perhaps whales of some vanished age. Others suspected they were something else altogether, but they knew enough to save some of the more remarkable specimens. And these began, over time, to make their way into the hands of collectors, of natural historians, of curious gentlemen with cabinets of curiosities in their country houses. One of the earliest to take a serious interest in these finds was a Dutch naturalist by the name of Pieter Harting. Working in the mid-19th century, Harting examined a growing collection of bones that had been dredged up from the North Sea and brought to the Netherlands. What he found when he compared them carefully with the bones of known animals was astonishing. These were, quite unmistakably, the remains of mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses, great Ice Age beasts, animals that had died out thousands of years ago. And yet, here they were, coming up from the middle of the North Sea, from waters that were now dozens of meters deep. Harting was puzzled. How had they gotten there? He speculated, tentatively, that perhaps the sea floor had once been dry land, that perhaps, in some ancient period, there had been a plain between Britain and the continent where these animals had lived. He did not push the idea very hard. He did not have the tools to prove it, but he planted a seed. That seed took a long time to grow. Because for many years afterward, the mainstream scientific view was that these bones, though interesting, could be explained without recourse to any lost land. The Victorian imagination preferred more familiar explanations. Perhaps the bones had washed out from ancient European river mouths and been carried far out to sea by currents. Perhaps they had been dropped by ancient glaciers, drifting on icebergs before falling to the sea floor. Various theories were floated. And most of them, though we now know them to be wrong, seemed reasonable enough at the time. Because to imagine that the North Sea itself had once been dry, that whole populations of great animals had walked upon its bed within human memory, well, that was a leap most Victorian scientists were not yet prepared to make. But the bones kept coming, and they kept getting stranger. In 1831, and this predates even Harting's work in some senses, a fisherman in the North Sea pulled up something that was not a bone at all. It was, when examined closely, a worked object. A tool, a pointed shaft of antler, delicately carved and barbed along its edges. It was a harpoon head, or a spear point, of the sort used by Mesolithic peoples for hunting, and it was clearly of great age. When it was eventually studied by archaeologists many decades later, it would be dated to some 13,000 years old. But at the time, in the 1830s, no one quite knew what to make of it. It went into a private collection, and it sat there quietly, waiting to be understood. It would take almost 100 years before its significance was fully grasped. Because to understand what it meant, one had to be willing to accept a truly startling idea. That people, not just animals but people, had once lived where now there was only sea. Well, throughout the second half of the 19th century, more and more artifacts of this sort continued to surface. Flint tools, bone points, fragments of worked antler, occasionally even human remains, a skull here, a fragment of jawbone there. Some of these finds were brought ashore by fishermen. Others were dredged up by the great harbour engineers who were, at that time, deepening the ports of London, Antwerp and Rotterdam. As they scooped away at the sea floor, they occasionally brought up objects that had no business being there. Objects that spoke, silently but insistently, of an ancient human presence beneath the waves. And slowly, ever so slowly, the picture began to sharpen. By the late Victorian period, a handful of forward-thinking scholars had begun to accept what the evidence was clearly showing, that at some point in the distant past, the North Sea basin must have been dry land. That people had lived there, and that whatever had drowned this land had done so long before the beginning of recorded history. The great breakthrough, or at least the moment when Doggerland began to be taken seriously as a scientific concept, came in the early 20th century. In 1913, a British geologist by the name of Clement Reid published a book. It was called Submerged Forests. In it, Reid gathered together decades of evidence, from bones and tools to actual preserved tree stumps that had been discovered beneath the sea in various parts of the British coast, and he made a compelling case. There had been, he argued, extensive forests and plains across what is now the North Sea. These had been drowned by rising seas after the last ice age, and people had lived among them. Reed's book, though modest in circulation, was influential among the small community of scholars interested in the ancient landscape. It gave the idea of a lost land beneath the North Sea a certain respectability. It gave it, for the first time, a place in the scientific conversation. And then came the discovery of 1931, the one we mentioned briefly at the start of our story. A fishing trawler, the Kalinda, working the North Sea some 40 miles from the English coast, dragged up in its nets a lump of peat. Now, this in itself was strange enough. Peat is a substance formed on land, in bogs and marshes, over thousands of years. It has no business being at the bottom of the sea, but there it was. And when the skipper of the Kalinda broke open the lump of peat to see what was inside, he found, embedded within it, a beautifully worked antler harpoon. A Mesolithic tool, sharp and pointed, its barbs still intact after who knew how many thousands of years. This was, in effect, the smoking gun. Here was direct evidence. Here was a peat block, formed on land, containing a human-made tool, and it had come from the middle of the North Sea. There was no longer any real doubt. People had lived there, and the sea had come and taken it. The Kalinda Point, as it came to be known, was studied intensely by British archaeologists over the following years. It was dated, eventually, to some 13,000 years old. It became a symbol, a tangible piece of proof that the drowned lands beneath the North Sea had not just been forests and grasslands, but had been human homelands. And the scientific community, however slowly, began to take the idea more seriously. Throughout the mid-20th century, various scholars pieced together more evidence. Bone finds were catalogued, sea floor maps were consulted, ancient climate data was gathered, and gradually a picture emerged of a great lost land stretching between Britain and the continent that had been home to significant human populations for many thousands of years. But it was not until the 1990s that the study of this lost land really came into its own. And this was largely due to the work of one particular archaeologist, a British woman by the name of Bryony Coles. Coles, working at the University of Exeter, took an interest in the drowned landscape of the North Sea and began to approach it in a systematic way. She gathered together all of the available evidence, from bones and tools to marine geological surveys, and she began to map out what this lost land might have looked like. She was essentially the first person to try to draw a map of it, to give it borders, to trace its rivers and coastlines and hills. And in 1998, in a landmark academic paper, she gave the land a name, Doggerland, named after the Dogger Bank, that great sandy shallow in the middle of the North Sea that is, we now know, the drowned high ground of the ancient continent. And with that naming, in a sense, Doggerland was reborn, not as a physical place, of course. That was long gone, but as an idea, as a subject of study, as a lost world that could at last be spoken of, mapped, imagined, and remembered. And once it had a name, Doggerland became a topic of serious interest to scientists across many disciplines. Archaeologists began to think about how to search for its remains. Geologists began to study its rivers and its geological history. Paleoclimatologists began to reconstruct its ancient weather patterns. And crucially, a new generation of researchers began to make use of a tool that would revolutionize the study of the drowned land. A tool that had, until then, been mostly the province of the oil and gas industry. That tool was seismic imaging. High-resolution sonar and seismic surveys, of the sort used to search for underwater oil deposits, could be used to peer beneath the sea floor, to see, in remarkable detail, the ancient landscape hidden beneath the sediment. And when the researchers, particularly those at the University of Birmingham in England, began to apply these techniques to the North Sea, well, what they found was quite extraordinary, because they were not just mapping a vague lost land. They were mapping, quite literally, ancient rivers, ancient hills, ancient lakes, ancient coastlines. The very shape of Doggerland, buried under thousands of years of sediment, began to appear on their screens, a ghost of a country, a phantom landscape drawn from beneath the mud, and it was every bit as detailed as they had dared to hope. And in the next section, we shall step aboard those research vessels ourselves and see what they found in the depths. Well, imagine, if you will, a research vessel out on the North Sea. It is the early 2000s, and the ship is one of many working across these busy waters. It rides the swells beneath a grey sky. Its deck is cluttered with equipment. Cables running from winches, computers humming inside cabins, scientists in waterproofs bent over screens, watching data flow in real time. To the untrained eye, it might look like any other survey ship, perhaps searching for oil, perhaps mapping the seafloor for shipping lanes. But this ship is doing something different, something remarkable. It is searching for a lost country, and beneath the churning waves, quietly and patiently, it is finding one. The technique these scientists were using, seismic reflection, works on a fairly simple principle. A specialized device, towed behind the ship, sends out powerful pulses of sound. These pulses travel down through the water, penetrate the seabed, and bounce off the various layers of rock and sediment beneath. The returning echoes are then picked up by sensors, again towed behind the ship, and translated by computers into images. What you get, in effect, is a cross-section view of what lies below, a vertical slice through the sea floor, showing layer upon layer of ancient sediment going down for hundreds of meters. And within those layers, if you know what to look for, you can see the traces of the world as it once was. Old river channels cut through the sediment, ancient shorelines, buried hills, old lake beds. It is like reading a book made of mud. And what the researchers began to read, well, it was a book about Doggerland. The team most closely associated with this work was based at the University of Birmingham in England. Led by a geographer named Vincent Gaffney, they had been given access to enormous amounts of seismic survey data, much of it originally collected by petroleum companies looking for oil and gas deposits beneath the North Sea. This data, gathered over decades and covering vast stretches of the sea floor, was normally used to identify likely spots for drilling. But Gaffney and his team realized it could be used for something else entirely. It could be used to reconstruct the ancient landscape of Doggerland, because the same seismic layers that told the oil companies where to drill also told archaeologists where the ancient rivers had run, where the old lakes had sat, where the coastlines had once been. And so, painstakingly, over several years, the Birmingham team began piecing together a map of Doggerland unlike anything that had come before. And what a map it turned out to be, because the seismic imaging revealed not just a vague blur, but a landscape of astonishing detail. Great rivers, kilometers wide, meandering across the plains, tributaries branching off from them, some of them themselves quite substantial, estuaries and marshes and coastal lagoons. Areas of higher ground standing above the flood plains, which would have been the hills and ridges of the ancient country. Lakes of various sizes, including several very large ones, some of them big enough to have been considered inland seas in their own right. And most tantalizing of all, in places, the researchers could actually see the ghostly outlines of what appeared to be ancient shorelines. Places where the sea had once lapped against the land, before the sea had gone somewhere else entirely, and the land had drowned. It was a landscape you could point to, a landscape you could describe, a landscape you could, in a very real sense, come to know. The greatest of the ancient rivers that ran through Doggerland became known, informally, as the Shotten River, named after Frederick Shotten, an earlier British geologist who had done pioneering work on ancient British landscapes. This great river system flowed through the heart of what had been Doggerland, gathering water from many tributaries, and eventually running southward to empty into the Atlantic somewhere near where the modern English Channel begins. It was, if the reconstructions are correct, comparable in scale to some of Europe's greatest modern rivers, perhaps something like the Rhine or the Danube. And along its banks, we can only imagine there would have been extraordinary hunting grounds. Vast reed beds full of waterfowl, fish in astonishing abundance, herds of deer and boar coming down to drink. Mesolithic peoples would have gathered there, would have built their camps along the great river's shores, would have known its floods and its rhythms as intimately as we know the streets of our own hometowns. And all of it, every stretch of shore, every hunting camp, every ancient fire pit, was now lying somewhere down in the darkness beneath the seismic ship's hull, buried under thousands of years of sediment, silent, waiting, perhaps someday to be found. The Birmingham team's mapping work, which continued for over a decade, produced results that eventually filled entire books. Their reconstructions covered thousands of square kilometers of sea floor. They identified probable settlement areas, likely burial grounds, potential fishing sites. They gave shape and substance to a country that had, until quite recently, been only a rumor and a name. And their work inspired researchers across Europe to take up the study of Doggerland with fresh energy. Universities in the Netherlands, in Denmark, in Belgium, in Germany all began to contribute, because Doggerland, it turned out, was everyone's ancient homeland, everyone whose ancestors had lived along the coasts of the North Sea. It was a shared inheritance, buried in a shared grave. But mapping the landscape, of course, was only part of the story. To truly understand Doggerland, the researchers needed more than just outlines of ancient rivers. They needed the actual stuff of the past, the bones, the tools, the pollen, the traces of the plants and animals and people who had once lived there. And to get those, they needed to reach beneath the sediment itself, which meant, in one form or another, digging into the sea floor, or having someone else do it for them. Some of these physical samples came from cores, long tubes driven down into the seabed, which brought up columns of ancient sediment, layered like the pages of a book, with older material at the bottom and younger material near the top. When these cores were examined in the laboratory, they revealed extraordinary things: preserved pollen grains, telling scientists what plants had grown at various times, microscopic seeds, fragments of ancient wood, sometimes even preserved insects or the bones of tiny animals. All of it perfectly sealed in the anaerobic mud, protected from decay for thousands of years. And by carbon dating these materials and analyzing them carefully, the researchers could reconstruct the changing environments of Doggerland over time, when it had been open tundra, when it had been forest, when the climate had warmed, when the seas had risen, when particular species had come and gone. It was, in effect, a diary of the drowned land, written in mud and pollen. And it was slowly, painstakingly, being read. Other physical evidence came from a rather unexpected source: the construction industry. Because in the early 2000s, the countries around the North Sea, particularly the Netherlands, were increasingly using sand from the sea floor to build coastal defenses and to expand land through reclamation projects. Enormous ships would go out into the shallow parts of the North Sea, scoop up huge quantities of sand from the seabed, and bring it ashore to be piled up for construction. And when they did this, they inevitably brought up other things too: bones, tools, fragments of ancient peat, occasionally even human remains. And so a most unusual arrangement developed, particularly on the Dutch coast. Amateur collectors and archaeologists began patrolling the beaches where this dredged sand was deposited, combing through it for artifacts. And they found, well, they found an extraordinary amount. Thousands upon thousands of pieces: mammoth teeth, auroch horns, Mesolithic flint blades, fragments of Neanderthal bone. It was a bit like a strange sort of open-air museum spread across the beaches, waiting for anyone with sharp eyes and patience to gather it up. One of the most famous of these finds came in 2009. On a beach near the Dutch town of Rotterdam, an amateur archaeologist named Willy van Wingerden noticed something odd among the dredged sand: a small fragment of bone, weathered but distinctive. When she picked it up and looked at it more closely, she realized what it was. It was a piece of human skull. Not modern human, but ancient. Very ancient. Later analysis would show it to be a fragment of a Neanderthal skull, one of the very few Neanderthal remains ever recovered from beneath the North Sea. It was roughly 40,000 years old. It had belonged, in life, to a young man who had walked upon Doggerland long before the Mesolithic peoples we have been discussing, long before even our own species had arrived in northern Europe in significant numbers. His skull, weathered by time and by sea, had lain beneath the waves for tens of thousands of years, only to be scooped up by a Dutch dredging vessel and dropped on a beach where a keen-eyed amateur had spotted it. A message, once again, from a lost world. And there have been many other finds. Human bones from various periods, some going back to the Neanderthals, some from anatomically modern humans of the Ice Age, others from the Mesolithic peoples who lived on Doggerland at its peak. There have been carved artifacts, ceremonial objects, tools and weapons. There have been the bones of extinct animals in staggering quantity, including mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave lions, and giant elk. Together, all of these finds paint a picture of Doggerland that was not just briefly inhabited by Mesolithic peoples in the last few thousand years of its existence, but had been visited and used by human beings in one form or another for tens of thousands of years. It was a land with a very long human history, a history that stretched back deep into the Ice Age and included multiple different peoples, different cultures, different species, all coming and going as the climate shifted and the land itself changed. Well, perhaps the most poignant of all the recent discoveries has been the recognition of what may have been ancient burial sites beneath the sea. In some places, the seismic and coring evidence suggests that particular locations in ancient Doggerland were used repeatedly for the burial of the dead. Places where, for reasons we cannot fully know, the Mesolithic peoples chose to lay their loved ones to rest. If these interpretations are correct, then somewhere down there, beneath the North Sea, lie the grave of countless generations of Doggerland's people. Their bones, their grave goods. The little tokens their families placed beside them when they were laid in the earth, all of it now buried beneath meters of sediment, beneath meters of seawater, waiting. And perhaps someday, though we cannot say when, some of these ancient graves may be found. Some of these people may, in a sense, be met at last. And in the next section, we shall explore what all of this rediscovered evidence is telling us about who they truly were, these vanished people of the drowned land. Well, as more and more of the scattered evidence from beneath the North Sea has been gathered and analyzed, the people of Doggerland have begun, slowly and gently, to come into focus. Not as individuals, of course. We shall never know their names or their faces, not truly, but as a people, as a community of communities, as a culture that stretched across a vanished landscape for many thousands of years. And what we are learning about them is quietly astonishing, because they were not, as older generations of scholars might have imagined, primitive or crude or in any way lesser than ourselves. They were, in fact, remarkably sophisticated, and their lives, though hard, were rich in ways that we in the modern world can barely comprehend. Take, for instance, their skills as craftsmen. The tools that have been recovered from beneath the North Sea and from the coasts of Denmark and Britain that once formed the edges of Doggerland are truly beautiful things. Not just functional, beautiful. A well-made Mesolithic microlith, one of those tiny flint blades used to tip arrows or spears, requires an extraordinary level of skill to produce. The flint napper must strike the stone at exactly the right angle, with exactly the right force, dozens of times in succession, working the raw stone down into a shape no larger than the tip of a modern pencil. And they did this without magnification, without steel tools, with nothing but their hands, a hammer stone, and generations of accumulated knowledge. Modern archaeologists who have tried to replicate Mesolithic tools describe it as extraordinarily difficult work. It takes years of practice to become even competent at it. And these people, well, they did it as a matter of daily life. Their work in bone and antler is perhaps even more impressive. The antler harpoons that have come up from the North Sea are quite simply works of art, delicately barbed, perfectly balanced, often decorated with subtle patterns of lines and dots that speak to some kind of aesthetic sensibility. Some carry markings that might have been decorative or might have been meaningful in ways we cannot decipher. Ownership marks, perhaps, or symbols connected to hunting rituals, or simply the personal touch of the craftsman who made them, signing his work as any artist might. And these harpoons were not disposable objects. They were valued. They were repaired when they broke. They were passed down, perhaps, from father to son, or from grandmother to grandchild. A single well-made antler point might have served its owner for many years, taking down uncounted deer or fish in its long service, before finally being lost or laid aside for good. Then there is their work in wood. Now, wood is a difficult material to preserve. It rots quickly, in most conditions, and disappears from the archaeological record with sad speed. But in the anaerobic mud of ancient bogs and in the buried layers beneath the North Sea, wood can sometimes survive. And when it does, we get glimpses of a truly remarkable woodworking tradition. The people of Doggerland and its neighboring lands made canoes by hollowing out entire tree trunks with fire and stone axes. These canoes could be quite large, capable of carrying several people and their equipment. They made platforms and walkways, laying split timbers side by side to create dry paths through marshy ground. They made bows for hunting, carefully shaped and often finished with such craftsmanship that they resemble bows made by traditional hunters even in relatively recent times. They made paddles, fish traps, basket weaves, even quite likely elements of house construction that we have not fully recovered because the wood itself is gone. These were, in every sense, sophisticated woodworkers, people who understood the properties of different trees, who knew when to harvest and when to season, who could shape their materials with skill and care. And then, well, then there is the matter of their inner lives, their beliefs, their spirituality. Now, this is a topic where we must tread carefully because we can never truly know what people so long dead thought about the mysteries of existence. We have no writing from them, no recorded prayers or songs, nothing that speaks directly to us in their own voices, but we do have evidence. Traces, hints, and what those hints suggest is that the people of Doggerland had rich and complex spiritual lives. Take the burial practices, for instance. Where Mesolithic burials have been found around the ancient edges of Doggerland, they show great care in the treatment of the dead. Bodies were laid out deliberately, often with grave goods, perhaps a favorite tool, a necklace of shells or animal teeth, a small pouch containing pigments. Sometimes the grave was sprinkled with red ochre, that deep rust-colored earth that has been associated with burial rites across countless human cultures for tens of thousands of years. The ochre may have symbolized blood or life or the sun. We cannot say for certain, but its presence tells us that these were not casual burials. These were sacred acts. These people believed something about death, something about what came after, and they enacted those beliefs with love and care for those they had lost. At the site of Star Car in Yorkshire, which sat on the ancient edge of Doggerland, archaeologists have found something else remarkable. Antler headdresses, made from the skulls of red deer with the antlers still attached, hollowed out and pierced so they could be worn on a human head. There are more than 20 of these headdresses, and they are unlike anything found elsewhere from that period. The most likely interpretation is that they were used in ritual, perhaps by shamans or spiritual leaders, perhaps by hunters undertaking some kind of ceremony before the chase or after it, perhaps in dances that connected the human world to the world of the animals. We can imagine, if we let ourselves, a firelit night at Star Car. Drums, perhaps, chanting. A figure moving through the flickering light with the head of a deer, the great antlers casting long shadows on the ground. Watching him, families gathered in a circle, wide-eyed children, old men and women nodding to the rhythm, a whole community drawn together into some shared sacred moment. We shall never know exactly what it meant to them, but we can be certain, from the trouble they took to make these things, that it meant a great deal, and they cared for each other. This too is worth saying, because it is easy to imagine the Mesolithic world as harsh and cruel. A world where the weak were left behind and only the strong survived. But the evidence from burials and settlements suggests something quite different. There are Mesolithic skeletons that show signs of severe injuries and long-term illness. Broken bones that had healed, missing limbs in some cases, people who could not on their own have hunted or foraged for their food. And yet these people lived, sometimes for many years after their injuries. Which means, quite simply, that others cared for them. Others brought them food. Others helped them move. Others made sure they were warm and fed and safe, even though they could no longer contribute in the ways that able-bodied members of the group did. That is not the mark of a brutal or callous society. That is the mark of a society that valued its members, that saw them as human beings worthy of care, even when they could no longer produce. And so, when we imagine Doggerland, we should imagine communities that were, in their own way, loving, tightly bonded, committed to their weakest and most vulnerable, just as the best of our own communities try to be. They also, in their own way, connected with peoples far beyond their own territories, because the archaeological evidence suggests that the Mesolithic peoples of northwestern Europe were not isolated. They traded. They exchanged goods and ideas across long distances. Flint from certain quarries has been found at sites hundreds of kilometers away. Certain types of shell jewelry appear in places far inland, where they must have been traded across many hands to arrive. There were networks of connection, paths of exchange. Perhaps annual gatherings where different groups came together for trade and marriage and ceremony. The people of Doggerland would almost certainly have been part of such networks. Their canoes would have carried them along the great river systems and out along the coasts. They would have met other peoples, exchanged goods, perhaps married into other groups, and carried back to their own hearths news and stories of distant places. So while their world was smaller than ours in some ways, in other ways it was surprisingly connected, and the loss of Doggerland would not have gone unnoticed by the peoples of surrounding lands. Its slow disappearance would have been felt as a disruption, a shift, a change in the web of relationships that connected the peoples of northwestern Europe. Well, one thing that modern science has been able to add to our understanding of the people of Doggerland is genetic. In recent years, advances in ancient DNA analysis have allowed researchers to extract genetic material from Mesolithic skeletons found around the North Sea. And what these studies have revealed is that the Mesolithic peoples of this region shared distinctive features that we can now imagine with some confidence. Many of them, it appears, had dark hair and dark skin, perhaps quite dark. It is a striking finding because it upends the older assumption that ancient Europeans were much like modern Europeans. In fact, the pale skin that is now common in northern Europe seems to have arrived later, with the coming of farming peoples from the Near East. The original hunter-gatherers of Doggerland and its surrounding lands, well, they looked rather different. Dark-skinned, dark-haired, and in some cases, remarkably, blue-eyed. That combination, dark skin and blue eyes, is very rare in the modern world, but it appears to have been common among the people of the drowned land. Try, if you can, to picture them. Standing on a ridge above the great Shotten River, dark-skinned and blue-eyed, wrapped in furs, spear in hand, looking out across a landscape no living person has ever seen. It is a vision from before the beginning of our recorded history. But it is a vision, we now know, that is quite close to the truth. And their descendants, well, their descendants live on. Because although Doggerland itself was lost, the people who fled it were not extinguished. They mingled with other populations. Their genes are still carried in one form or another by many of the peoples of modern Europe. Every person of ancient European descent, in some sense, has ancestors who once lived on Doggerland, or who might have. The bloodlines are that deeply mixed. So the people of the drowned land, in a way, have not entirely disappeared. Their bodies lie beneath the sea. Their homes and their fires and their names are all gone. But their descendants walk the earth today. They speak modern languages. They live in modern cities. And they carry within them, unknowing but real, the echoes of a lost country. And in the next section, we shall consider what has become of Doggerland as an idea in modern times. How the drowned land has begun, at last, to be remembered. Well, in the last few decades, something rather quiet but rather wonderful has happened. Doggerland, that long-forgotten land beneath the North Sea, has slowly begun to enter the modern imagination, not in the great trumpeting way that some historical discoveries do. There have been no blockbuster films made about it, no epic novels that have swept the bestseller lists. It has crept in more gently than that, but it has crept in, and more people, across Europe and beyond, are coming to know its name, to understand, at least in broad strokes, what it was. And to feel, in the strange, quiet way that one feels these things, a certain wonder at the idea of a lost country beneath the sea. Part of what has driven this is the work of the scholars we have already mentioned, the mapping projects at Birmingham, the archaeological surveys along the Dutch coast, the genetic studies of ancient bones. These have all trickled out into the wider world through documentaries, through museum exhibitions, through popular science books written by researchers who wanted to share what they were finding with the public. And little by little, Doggerland has entered the vocabulary of educated people around the world. It has become one of those quiet touchstones, a phrase that, when someone mentions it in conversation, causes eyebrows to rise and heads to tilt. A lost country beneath the sea. Well, yes, just there, between Britain and the continent. It sounds like the stuff of legend. But it is not legend. It is history, and it has captured the imagination, particularly of artists and writers. In recent years, a number of novels have been set in or around Doggerland, some of them work of speculative fiction that reimagine what life might have been like for the people who lived there. Others use the drowned land as a metaphor, for loss, for the passage of time, for the fragility of the world we take for granted, because that, in a way, is what Doggerland is. It is a symbol ready-made of everything we assume to be permanent and unchanging. It reminds us that even the very shape of the earth is not fixed, that coastlines shift, that familiar places can vanish, that whole worlds can be lost, and that the sea, patient and eternal, remembers nothing of what it swallows. It just keeps rolling on. Poets have written about it too. There is something inherently poetic about Doggerland, about the mixture of vast scale and human intimacy that it evokes. Whole generations lived there. Whole languages were spoken. Songs were sung around fires. Children played in shallow streams. And all of it, every note and word and laugh and tear, is gone. Not just gone, but gone in a way that leaves almost no trace. It is a kind of erasure so complete that it forces us to think about our own permanence or the lack of it. Because if such a world could vanish, well, what does that say about our own world? About the cities and monuments and cultures that seem so solid to us? Could they, too, someday be lost so thoroughly that no memory of them survives? It is the sort of question that quietly haunts a person once they let it in. And Doggerland, more than almost any other place in the human story, invites us to ask it. At the same time, there has been growing interest from environmentalists and climate scientists in the lessons of Doggerland, because the story of the drowned land is not just an ancient story. It is a story with modern relevance. Doggerland, after all, was destroyed by rising seas, not through any human fault, of course. The sea level rise that ended it was entirely natural, driven by the melting of the great ice sheets at the end of the last glacial period. But the mechanism, in its essentials, was the same one that concerns us today: warming climate, melting ice, rising water, and whole landscapes, once inhabited, becoming inhabitable. It is not lost on modern scientists that Doggerland provides a kind of long historical example of what happens when the seas come for the land. The Mesolithic peoples had no choice in the matter. Their world was reshaped by forces far beyond their control. Ours, some argue, could be reshaped by forces of our own making, not on quite the same timescale perhaps, and not, in most cases, quite so completely. But the principle is the same. Coastlines are not eternal, and what the sea takes, it does not easily give back. There is a sobering statistic that gets quoted sometimes in this context. Roughly 40% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers of a coastline. And a great many of the world's most important cities, in every country of the world, sit right on the water's edge. If sea levels were to rise by even a few meters in the coming centuries, well, the maps of the world we know today would look very different. Whole cities would need to be relocated. Whole regions would need to be abandoned. And the people forced from their homes, if such a scenario ever came to pass, would face challenges not entirely unlike those faced by the last inhabitants of Doggerland: loss of homeland, displacement, the need to start again somewhere new. Now, one hopes and expects that human ingenuity will find ways to avoid the worst outcomes, that we shall learn in time to protect the coasts we can protect, and to move with grace and dignity from the ones we cannot. But Doggerland stands there in the background, quiet and drowned, a reminder that the sea always eventually gets its way if we let it. Well, there has also been renewed interest in the actual physical exploration of what remains of Doggerland beneath the sea. And this is exciting work. Some of the most ambitious projects have proposed, for instance, the possibility of underwater archaeological dives to specific sites where the seismic imaging suggests that ancient settlements once stood. It is difficult work, of course. The North Sea is cold, murky, and often stormy. Diving in it is hazardous even in the best conditions, and the sea floor over most of what was Doggerland is deep enough that ordinary recreational diving is out of the question. It would require specialized equipment, trained crews, extensive funding, but the potential rewards, well, they are immense, because somewhere down there, protected by anaerobic mud, there may be organic remains that have never been recovered anywhere else: wooden structures, basketry, textiles even, preserved by the same conditions that have preserved so many finds from ancient bogs and lakes across northern Europe. Someday, if the will and the resources can be found, we may see actual excavation of Doggerland sites. And what such an excavation might reveal is almost beyond imagining. There are also, in a few places, opportunities to see actual pieces of Doggerland today. Museums in Britain, the Netherlands, and Belgium hold significant collections of finds from the ancient land. If you go to the museum in Rotterdam or to certain museums in Eastern England, you can stand in front of glass cases and look at actual objects that were made and used by the people of Doggerland. Little worked antler tools, fragments of bone, pieces of ancient peat with tree roots still embedded in them, brought up from the sea floor. It is a strange experience, standing there, knowing that the object you are looking at was made by hands that belonged to a person who lived on a land that no longer exists, who breathed the air of a country that has been drowned for 8,000 years, and who, in some small way, is reaching across all of that time to touch your own life. It is quietly moving, if you let it be, and it reminds us that even the deepest silence of history is not truly silent. It just needs the right ear to hear it. There is talk from time to time of some sort of grand memorial to Doggerland, some sort of monument or museum dedicated specifically to remembering the drowned land and its people. Nothing quite like this exists yet, but the idea keeps coming up in various forms. Some have suggested that one of the North Sea coastal towns in either Britain or the Netherlands could host a museum dedicated to Doggerland, a place where visitors could learn about the ancient land, see the artifacts that have been recovered, and reflect on what has been lost. Others have proposed more ambitious ideas, a sort of virtual reconstruction of Doggerland that could be experienced in immersive digital form, walking through recreated Mesolithic villages, watching computer-generated deer graze on virtual plains, standing on a digital shore beside the ancient Shotten River. It is the sort of thing that might, in the years to come, actually be built. And it would be, if it were done well, a remarkable way to bring the drowned land back into the light for at least a little while. A way to let visitors experience, however imperfectly, a world that was otherwise closed off from us forever. Meanwhile, ordinary people go on with their ordinary lives, mostly unaware of the vanished land beneath the North Sea. Ships pass over it every day. Fishermen work above it. Oil platforms drill through the sediment layers that hold its ancient secrets. Airplanes fly overhead. And beneath it all, silent and dark, Doggerland waits, its rivers, its hills, its buried burial sites, its long-forgotten hearths where families once gathered against the cold. It is all still there, not gone, not really, just hidden, waiting for whoever, in years and centuries to come, may still find it. Because though the sea has taken the land, it has not truly destroyed it. The sediment has, in many places, protected it, sealed it, kept it safe from the ordinary processes of decay. And so there is a strange kind of hope in the story of Doggerland. A hope that, though the land itself is unreachable, someday the people who lived there may finally get the recognition they deserve. That someday we may know their names for their tools, their songs, their beliefs. That someday we may in some sense meet them at last. Their story, though ancient, is not finished. It is still being written, slowly, patiently, by the scientists and archaeologists and thinkers who are, at last, turning their attention to what has been forgotten for so very long. Well, we come now to the end of our story, and in this final section, let us take a moment to sit quietly with Doggerland, to reflect on what its story means, and to consider gently what we might carry away from it. Because a story like this one, a story of a whole world lost beneath the sea, is not just a piece of ancient history. It is a mirror, a quiet mirror held up to our own time. And in the reflection, if we look long enough, we can see something of ourselves, our own fragility, our own beauty, our own capacity for endurance, and perhaps most powerfully of all, our own place in the long, slow flow of time. Let us return one last time to the shores of Doggerland. Let us imagine ourselves standing on a low grassy rise, somewhere in what would be the middle of the modern North Sea. It is, perhaps, 10,000 years ago. The sun is setting, casting long golden light across the wide plains. A gentle wind moves through the willows along a nearby stream. In the distance, we can see the smoke of a small settlement curling up from cooking fires. Children's voices, faint and happy, drift across the meadow. A hunter walks slowly home along a well-worn path, a brace of ducks slung across his shoulder. His wife looks up as she sees him coming, and she smiles. In another moment, they will greet each other. Their children will come running to meet him. They will sit down together to their evening meal. And when the meal is done, the elders will tell stories by the firelight, and the young ones will listen wide-eyed until sleep at last carries them away. This is a scene of ordinary human life. Nothing grand, nothing spectacular, just people living their days as best they can, loving each other, feeding each other, telling their stories, going on. And in this scene, in this quiet moment we have imagined together, lies the true heart of Doggerland. Because Doggerland was not just a landscape, it was a home. It was where people lived their lives, where they knew joy and sorrow, where they raised their children and buried their dead, where the ordinary business of being human unfolded, day by day, generation by generation, for thousands upon thousands of years. And when the sea finally came for it, what was lost was not just a piece of geography. What was lost was a homeland, every ordinary hearth, every well-trodden path, every remembered face and beloved name, all of it taken away, not because those people were less real than we are, not because their lives mattered less than ours do, but simply because the world does what the world does. The ice melts, the waters rise, the land goes under, and what came before is in time forgotten. There is in this a sort of gentle sorrow, but there is also, I think, something quietly hopeful. Because although Doggerland is gone, the people who lived there endured, not by staying put, but by moving, by adapting, by finding new lands and starting again. Their descendants scattered across northwestern Europe, their bloodlines mingled with those of countless other peoples. Their genes are quite possibly still present in the bodies of many of us listening tonight. So in a very real sense, Doggerland was not entirely destroyed. Its people carried it forward. They took the story of it, in whatever form they could, into the future. And though the specific memories have long since faded, something of them remains. Something of them lives, in the shape of a face, perhaps, in the color of an eye, in the deep instincts that come to us in dreams. Somewhere in us, that lost land still lingers, however faintly, however far away. And I think there is another lesson in Doggerland too, a lesson about the value of ordinary lives. Because we tend, in our reading of history, to focus on the grand and famous figures, the kings, the generals, the great scholars and inventors and warriors, those whose names have come down to us in written records, whose deeds are memorialized in books and statues and monuments. But the people of Doggerland, they had none of that. Not one of them left a name behind. Not one of them had their story written down. Their lives were, in that sense, entirely anonymous. Every last one of them, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, has faded into the great silence of forgotten time. And yet their lives mattered, their laughter mattered, their tears mattered, their small kindnesses and daily labors mattered, to them, to their families, to the communities they belonged to. And when we imagine them now, thousands of years later, and when we take the time to acknowledge that they existed, that they were real, that they lived and loved and died, we do them a kind of honor, a quiet, belated honor, but an honor all the same. Because the truth is, most human beings who have ever lived have been ordinary people, not kings, not great warriors, not famous scholars, just people. Ordinary people, going about their ordinary lives, doing the best they could with what they had. Most of us are like that. Most of the people you love, most of the people you have ever loved are like that. And someday, all of us, without exception, will be forgotten too. Our names will be lost. Our faces will fade from memory. The details of our lives will vanish into the great archives of time. And it will not matter in a certain cold sense. The universe will roll on, indifferent as it always has. But in another sense, in the sense that really counts, it will have mattered enormously. Because we were here, we loved, we laughed. We contributed our small threads to the great weave of human existence. And that, in the end, is what the people of Doggerland can teach us. That mattering does not require being remembered. Mattering is its own reward. Mattering is what happens when we live our ordinary lives with grace and love and courage. And whether anyone remembers us or not, in 10,000 years, well, that is not really the point. The point is that we were here at all, and we did our best. Well, it is getting late now, and I think it is time for us to leave Doggerland at last, to let the Mesolithic hunter, standing on his golden hilltop at sunset, fade back into the mist of history where he belongs. to let the wave of the Storega tsunami roll away into the past where it can no longer harm anyone, to let the sea close as it did so long ago over the drowned land, and to let the people of Doggerland rest at last, wherever they are, in whatever way rest comes to those long departed. But before we close this evening, let us give them one small thing. Let us give them our attention, our recognition, our gratitude even, for having lived, for having endured, for having, in ways they never knew, laid part of the foundation upon which so much of Europe and its descendants have been built. They were the first people of the North Sea basin. They were the pioneers who followed the retreating ice. They were the parents and grandparents of a great deal of what came after. And though they are gone, they are not entirely gone. Not tonight. Not while we still speak their story to each other. I want to thank you, as always, for being here with me this evening. It is a privilege to share these stories with you, to sit together in this quiet space, wherever you happen to be listening from, and to think together about the deep past, about the people who came before us, about the world as it once was, and about the ways in which it still lives on, in echoes and traces and whispered memories that only the very patient can hear. If this story has stayed with you, if it has moved you in some small way, I hope you will consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel if you have not yet. It really does help us to keep making these videos, and it lets me know which stories are landing with you, so I can find more like them to bring to you in the weeks and months ahead. I want to give a special thanks, as always, to my wonderful patrons and channel supporters. Without them, we could not keep this channel ad-free. They are the reason you do not have to sit through interruptions while trying to unwind. Their generosity is what keeps this quiet space quiet. So thank you from the bottom of my heart to every single one of you who has ever contributed. You know who you are, and you are appreciated more than words can say. If you would like to join them, all the links are in the description below. But please, only if you are able. Just being here, just listening, is more than enough. Well, that is where we shall leave things tonight. Somewhere out there, beneath the cold grey waters of the North Sea, the bones of Doggerland lie sleeping. The rivers that once ran through it are still there, buried beneath the mud. The hearths where people once cooked their meals still lie where they were left. The grave of ancient families still hold their long-forgotten dead. And someday, perhaps, we may find some of them again. We may bring their names back into the light, or at least their faces. We may learn a little more of what they knew and how they lived and what they believed. Until then, they wait, silent, patient, undisturbed by the passing centuries. And now that we have spent this evening with them, perhaps you will think of them from time to time when you look at a map of Europe. Perhaps you will glance at that patch of blue between Britain and the mainland, and you will remember there was a country there once, and people who loved it, and it is gone now. But it was real. Sleep well, my friends, rest deeply, and I shall see you again very soon. Farewell for now. Lots of love to you all.